Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant, bringing you part 3 of my series discussing the Star Wars vs. Battlestar Galactica contest. This part will discuss the offensive capabilities of each faction. As a reminder from part 1, this is a comparison of the Star Wars Imperial Empire, circa the Battle of Endor, when it was at the height of its power, versus the 12 colonies of Kobol prior to them getting nuked into oblivion, and in a parallel comparison versus the Cylons, also immediately prior to nuking the 12 colonies of Kobol into oblivion. I'll start with the Imperials. An Imperial 2 Star Destroyer is equipped with 60 dual turbolaser batteries, 60 heavy ion cannons, 8 octuple turbolaser barbettes mounted on the sides that are used for broadsiding enemies, 6 dual concussion missile turrets, and 10 tractor beam projectors. They also carry a complement of 48 TIE fighters, 12 TIE bombers, 12 TIE interceptors, as well as 20 AT-AT walkers, 30 AT-ST walkers, 8 Lambda-class shuttles, and at least 2 Gonzati-class cruisers, as well as a garrison of 9,700 stormtroopers. In short, Imperial 2 Star Destroyers have a truly absurd amount of weaponry and carry around an equally absurd amount of fighters and walkers to handle most situations pretty much independently. For the Colonial Fleet, I'll be giving the stats on the Jupiter-class Battlestar, despite them not really featuring much in the show, seeing as most of them were blown up in the pilot. They are, in fact, more powerful than Galactica. They just had a software exploit that the Cylons used to shut them off. On to armament. The Jupiter-class Battlestars carried 24 primary dual KEW, 12 missile tubes, as well as 514 dual point defense KEW. They also carried a complement of Viper fighters and Raptor support shuttles. The exact fighter complement of your typical Jupiter-class Battlestar isn't something I was actually able to track down, but from what I could track down, Galactica could potentially carry 160 active Vipers, though it didn't have that many available at any point during the show, but I'll assume that between 160 and 180 is a good ballpark for the Viper complement of the Jupiter-class. These could be launched 40 at a time via the Battlestar's Viper launch tubes and would undoubtedly consist of a mix of Viper versions, but for the sake of this comparison, I'll just assume that all of them are Viper 7s. Each Viper carries 3 KEW. As for the Cylons, their go-to capital ship is the Base Star, which utilizes about 168 missile launchers and carries 434 Raiders, all of which could be launched simultaneously as they each have their own launch bays. Each Raider carries 2 KEW and 12 missiles. So now the big question, what does this all mean? How destructive are all these weapons? Again, we'll start with Star Wars. In The Empire Strikes Back, we get a clear view of at least a minimum level of energy being thrown around by the Star Destroyers while they're in the midst of the asteroid belt trying to find the Millennium Falcon, and they're able to vaporize some giant rocks in a single hit. I won't bore you with going into the math, so you can check out my sources, but suffice to say, doing so would require about 30 terajoules or 30 million megajoules of energy, so the turbolasers have to be putting out at least that much energy per shot. The weapons are manually targeted by gunnery crews and have an effective range about 1,200 kilometers. Each TIE fighter carries a pair of L-S1 laser cannons, which are effective for destroying enemy fighters, but less useful against larger or more shielded or armored targets. TIE interceptors carry 6 of the more powerful L-S9.3 laser cannons, so they hit harder than regular TIE fighters, but they're still of limited use against better protected targets. As for Battlestar Galactica armaments, both factions mainly utilize KEW or kinetic energy weapons, but their heavy weapons consist of both conventional and nuclear missiles. Unfortunately, this is extremely unhelpful. A kinetic energy weapon could refer to anything from a baseball bat to high explosives. In this case, your typical KEWs seem to consist of a mix of railguns and chemically propelled ordnance, regular bullets, the yield of which is totally unexplained beyond them being capable of destroying what they need to destroy. But one of the big differences we see in the show is that the ordnance used by the fighters seem to just be kind of spray and pray dumbfire bullets, while the stuff that we see Galactica use is a lot heavier and capable of performing airburst, which allows them to create a wall of explosive death alongside their ships. The range of this seems to be quite limited, though. Missiles used by both factions seem to do the same thing as the KEWs, but better, having the benefit of being able to pack plenty of high explosives in the tips and also being guided instead of dumbfire. That is, of course, unless they're nuclear, in which case the damage capabilities are amped up pretty dramatically, but still there's no canonical source I can find or even fan calculations that would tell me the yield of one of those nukes. Important to note also is that any missiles are vulnerable to being intercepted by either fighters or Galactica's own systems and shot down before they can make any contact. So, as for the yield of those nukes, we can try to do a little bit of referencing. A 1 kiloton explosion releases 4.18 gigajoules of energy, while a 1 megaton explosion releases 4.18 petajoules of energy. This means that the largest nuclear test ever performed on Earth, the Tsar Bomba, with its 50 to 58 megaton rating, released 210 to 240 petajoules of energy. So how does this compare to turbo lasers? Well, I think it's safe to say that one nuke versus one turbo laser, nukes will punch harder. We don't know the yield of the nukes used in Battlestar Galactica, but we can pretty safely assume that they're closer to the megaton range of power rather than the kiloton range. But let's compare apples to apples as much as we can. A single turbo laser shot outputs at least 30 terajoules of energy, which means they're each hitting at least as hard as a 7 kiloton nuke. Comparing that to the KEWs we see use in BSG, I'm pretty confident in saying that none of the ones we see in use are packing nearly that much punch. So that's really all I could come up with for conventional weaponry on each side, but we should also consider other elements that each side uses. Of the factions, the Colonial Fleet probably has the most normal ships and weapons by modern standards. Cylons branch out a little bit and integrate cyber warfare as well, which is why in BSG the fleet of survivors is led by a museum-quality Battlestar Galactica and a bunch of antique Viper 2s, since their tech was dumbed down specifically to avoid getting hacked. The Empire uses mostly energy weapons, with the workhorse weaponry being blasters of varying power levels from the handheld blasters used by stormtroopers, to point defense lasers mounted on ships, to turbo lasers used for large-scale ship-to-ship combat, to the Death Star super laser capable of pulverizing a planet. They're all the same thing, just way different power levels. They also use ion cannons, which basically use an EMP effect at their target, overloading electronics and causing high damage to shields. They use concussion missiles, which are basically useless against large targets, but are fast and agile enough to take out fighters. And they use tractor beams, which allow them to hold targets immobile in ideal target positions so they can be thoroughly smashed to pieces with concentrated fire. Finally, we'll talk briefly about troop weaponry for each faction. The Empire uses blasters, which are capable of doing lethal damage to targets not protected by either highly specialized or heavy armor. The Colonial Fleet uses basically what amounts to somewhat more advanced modern firearms, which are quite capable of killing their targets, though, again, of limited use versus armor. And then Cylon Centurions have built-in weaponry, including claws for close range and some sort of projectile weaponry, which again is great for killing soft targets, but they can also carry heavier weaponry like rocket launchers or heavier machine guns, just like anybody else. So there you go. My summary of the offensive capabilities of each faction, both in space and on the ground. I basically am trying to establish generalized capabilities for destruction here. Numbers on any of the factions are really hard to actually get a hold of, so if you find some sources that I wasn't able to find, please reference them in the comments. That would be really helpful. But yeah, until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.